Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are exploring a truly monumental shift in how we understand human communication. For centuries, philosophers basically just assumed language was primarily a tool for painting pictures of reality, just a way to describe facts. But back in 1969, an American philosopher named John Searle published a revolutionary book called Speech Acts, and he completely flipped our understanding of language on its head, proving that it isn't just some simple describing tool, it is actually a reality-altering superpower.
To really grasp the magnitude of this, I want you to picture this scenario. Imagine you are standing in a courtroom. A judge slams down a wooden gavel, looks you dead in the eye, and says, "I sentence you to 5 years in prison." Now think about what actually just happened, physically. A human pushed air out of their lungs, vibrated their vocal cords, and sent acoustic waves through the air. That is it. Literally just invisible physical vibrations. Yet in that exact instant, your entire legal status, your freedom, your whole social reality completely changed. So how on earth can mere words, just vibrating air, alter human reality so drastically?
Section 1. Words that create reality. From describing to doing. Let's dive right in.
So, taking a quick trip back to the early 20th century, specifically the 1920s, a group of thinkers called the Logical Positivists completely dominated philosophy. And they had this incredibly rigid view. They believed language was strictly for describing testable facts. If a sentence couldn't be scientifically tested, they literally just dismissed it as nonsense. But then along came a brilliant Oxford philosopher named J.L. Austin. He pointed out a massive, glaring flaw in this thinking. He realized that a lot of sentences don't describe reality at all. Rather, they perform actions. Think about it. When I say, "I bet you $10, I'm not describing a scientific fact. I am actively performing the action of making a bet. Austin called these performatives.
Now, John Searle was actually Austin's student, and he took this messy foundational work and formalized it. His core thesis was that speaking a language is performing speech acts. And crucially, these acts are made possible by and performed in accordance with certain rules. He was basically saying that speaking is an action governed by an underlying set of rules, very much like a game.
Which brings us to Section 2, Rules of the Game, Regulative versus Constitutive. Pause for a second and think about what a rule actually is. Searle's absolute greatest breakthrough was splitting all the rules in the universe into two distinct types. First, you have regulatory rules. These simply regulate behaviors that already exist independently of the rule. Traffic laws are a great example. People can physically drive cars without any rules, but we create the rule, drive on the right side of the road, just to regulate that existing behavior. On the flip side, we have constitutive rules. These are totally different. They don't just regulate, they actually create or constitute the activity itself. Take the game of chess. If you remove the rules of chess, the game literally ceases to exist. You're just moving carved pieces of wood around on a checkered board. Constitutive rules create entirely new forms of reality. Searle brilliantly captured the structure of these constitutive rules in this legendary, simple formula. X counts as Y in context C. Think about how this applies to our daily lives. Putting your signature on a piece of paper, that's X, counts as a binding contract, that's Y, in the context of modern business law, which is C. It turns out language is just this massive system of these constitutive rules, where the sounds coming out of our mouths actually count as binding moral and social commitments. Let's move on to Section 3, Anatomy of a Speech Act, the 4 layers and 5 categories. Let's pull back the curtain here. When you say a really simple sentence like, "John, please close the window," there are actually 4 distinct acts happening at the exact same time. First, the utterance act, simply making the physical sounds with your mouth. Second, the propositional act, referring to specific entities out in the world, like John in the window. Third, the illocutionary act. This is the actual action or intent behind the words, like requesting or ordering. And finally, fourth, the perlocutionary act, the effect it has on the listener, like John actually getting up and closing the window. Now, the absolute crucial distinction here is that the illocutionary act, your intent, is completely under your control as the speaker. But the perlocutionary act, how the listener reacts, is not. You can successfully order someone to do something even if they flat out refuse to do it. And what's really fascinating about this is how Searle brought absolute order to human language. He basically proved that out of the millions of sentences spoken globally every single day, every illocutionary act falls perfectly into one of just 5 categories. That's it. You have assertives, which state facts, directives, where you're trying to get the listener to do something, commissives, where you commit yourself to a future action, expressives, showing how you feel, and declarations.
the ultimate superpower that changes reality the very moment the words are spoken.
Now, this introduces a seriously mind-bending concept known as the direction of fit. Imagine a shopper walking around with a grocery list. Their goal is to make the physical contents of their shopping cart match the words on their list. That is words to words. Now, imagine a detective following that exact same shopper, furiously writing down everything they put in the cart. The detective's goal is entirely different. They want to make their written notes match the physical world. That is words to world. It's a beautifully elegant way to explain whether a sentence is trying to describe reality or trying to actively change it.
Okay, so what actually makes a speech act successful? Let's use the act of making a promise as a quick case study. For a promise to actually be a valid promise, it has to meet these precise felicity conditions. First, you can only promise a future action by yourself. Second, the preparatory conditions, the listener has to actually want you to do it. Think about it. If they don't want you to do it, it's not a promise, it's a threat. Third, sincerity. You genuinely must intend to do it. Interestingly, though, if you violate sincerity and lie, you are still held morally responsible for making the promise. And fourth, the essential condition. Uttering the words legally or morally binds you to that obligation. Violate that, and you're just an actor reciting lines on a stage.
Moving right along to Section 4, reading between the lines, indirect speech and reference.
How does all this work in real life when we start reading between the lines? Because, let's be honest, people almost never say exactly what they literally mean. Take the classic dinner table salt analogy. If you ask your friend, "Can you pass the salt?" Grammatically speaking, you are asking a literal yes or no question about their physical ability. If they took it literally, they just flex their muscles, say, "Yes, I am physically capable," and keep eating. But they don't do that, right? They immediately recognize it as an indirect speech act. You say one sentence, but you fully expect the listener to magically realize you mean another, a directive request for action. So how exactly does the human brain decode this so unbelievably fast? If someone asks, "Do you want to go to the movies?" and you reply, "I have to study," you didn't actually say the word no, yet the listener instantly understands. They do this by firing through a rapid logical inference chain. They rely on background knowledge, like knowing that studying takes up time, mutual context about what you're doing that evening, the basic conversational rule that your answer must somehow be relevant to the question, and checking those felicity conditions we just talked about. It's an incredibly complex mental dance that we all do in a fraction of a second.
Searle also tackled how words manage to latch onto objects in the real world through something called the cluster theory of names. How does a name like Aristotle actually work? Well, Searle explained that we don't just rely on one strict dictionary definition. Instead, the name references a cluster or a bundle of facts: student of Plato, teacher of Alexander, famous Greek philosopher. As long as the object satisfies a sufficient bundle of those descriptions, the reference works perfectly. Essentially, he transformed the whole concept of reference into an active speech act performed by the speaker.
And finally, Section 5, AI, Law, and Society, the matrix in action.
The really crucial point here is that these aren't just abstract textbook puzzles for philosophers to argue about in a vacuum. To see this matrix in action, it's important to look at the massive debates this theory sparked. In the 1970s, a legendary intellectual feud erupted between John Searle and the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Searle, representing analytic philosophy, heavily argued that language relies on clear, structured, constitutive rules and the conscious, present intention of the speaker. Derrida, representing continental philosophy, offered a deconstructive critique. He neutrally argued that written language operates even when the author is entirely absent or even dead, making language inherently unstable and ambiguous. For Derrida, there are no fixed rules that guarantee meaning. It is a completely fascinating clash of logical structure versus linguistic ambiguity. These tools are also actively applied in social analysis today. Feminist philosophers, most notably Ray Langton, have applied Searle's framework to really dig into concepts like free speech and power dynamics. Langton introduced a powerful concept called illocutionary silencing. This theory proposes that in certain hostile social contexts, a speaker might attempt to perform a specific speech act, like a refusal, but the environment actually prevents the listener from recognizing its true illocutionary force. Essentially, the social context itself disables the speaker's ability to successfully perform the act.
And stepping beyond philosophy, speech act theory is quite literally the backbone of our modern systems. For an AI to actually be useful, natural language processing engineers have to program it to recognize illocutory force, right? It needs to know that your prompt is a directive command, not just an assertive observation about the world. Furthermore, our legal system is basically applied speech act theory.
Contract law relies entirely on formal commissus and declarations. Criminal law can spend months just trying to distinguish whether a defendant's statement was a neutral assertive observation or an illegal directive mob threat.
Which brings us to a massive, highly relevant dilemma in the age of large language models. According to Searle's Felicity Conditions, a sincere speech act absolutely requires a real human intent, belief, or psychological state. So if ChatGPT tells you, "I am so sorry you had a bad day," is it actually performing a true expressive speech act of apologizing? Or is it just statistically simulating text without any genuine internal psychological state whatsoever? It completely reframes how we have to view machine communication.
And that brilliantly illustrates the enduring power of Searle's theory. Language isn't just describing reality, it is the very architecture of our social world. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge. Take a look at your own life, your text messages, your everyday conversations. What is the hidden illocutionary force behind your favorite indirect speech act? Think about it, and you'll probably rethink every conversation you have from this day forward.
Please like and subscribe.